The Penderwicks, A Summer Tale of 4 Sisters, 2 Rabbits, and a Very Interesting Boy, by Jeanne Birdsall. Chapter 11. Another Rescue. As soon as Batty had decided she must find Yaz, she tried to do just that. She looked all over Arundel Gardens for him, calling his name, begging him to show himself. 3 times she went around all the statues, urns, fountains, and beds full of flowers, but nowhere could she find a rabbit. Despairing, she was sure Yaz was gone for good. Now there was only one thing left for her to do. If only she could be brave enough. She was brave enough, she told herself sternly, and so, at about the same time that Rosalind left the cottage with brownies for Cagney, Batty climbed over the low stone wall that marked the back edge of the Arundel Gardens. She was going home. Not to the cottage, to her real home, in Cameron, where there was no Mrs. Tifton, no lost Yaz, and no Cagney and Carla, whose hearts Batty had broken. She would get there by nightfall, and sleep in her own bed, and maybe, just maybe, by the time her sisters and father came home too, they wouldn't be so very angry at her. She knew the way. Arundel was in the mountains, and Cameron wasn't, so she must keep going downhill. And whenever the land was flat, she must head toward the sun, for Skye had once said that Cameron was east of Arundel, and that east, whatever that was, had something to do with the sun. Unfortunately, soon the sun was overhead and gave no clues whatsoever, but Batty still plodded on. If she hadn't been so unhappy, the first part of her journey would have been pleasant. It was mostly through fields, and there were bright, waving wildflowers, big bugs that hopped as high as her nose, and even some butterflies that followed Batty from one field to the next, apparently thinking her a giant queen of the butterflies. And just when she was so hot she thought she'd die, she came to a shallow, trickling stream, and she waded right in and sat down in the water, thought how nice it was without an OAP to tell her no. But best of all was what she found in the field next to the stream, 2 horses standing behind a fence, just waiting for Batty to come over and pick handfuls of clover to hold up high enough so that they could snuffle at it with their velvety black lips. That is, the horses were the best of all until Batty noticed that one was brown with spots like Yaz, and the other was white like Carla, and that they nuzzled each other with great affection, and she thought about how sad they would be if one of them ran away and left the other alone forever. Batty said goodbye to the horses and trudged off. "She's not here in the garden," said Rosalind. She, Geoffrey, Skye, and Jeanne had just met back at the Marble Thunderbolt Man for a status report. "I checked all around the carriage house, and my house, and with Churchy. She hasn't seen Batty all day, and Cagney's still not back," said Geoffrey. "She's not in the cottage. After Skye and I took Hound back, I looked in every room, under the beds, in her secret passage closet, everywhere," said Jeanne. "And I searched all over the cottage grounds," said Skye. Rosalind shaded her eyes from the sun and stared into the distance, first in one direction and then another, hoping desperately for a glimpse of a little girl in wings. But there was nothing except gardens, and farther away, trees and the mountains. "It's time to tell Daddy." She was very pale. "He's not back from town yet," said Jeanne. "Then what should we do? What can we do? This is all my fault. I promised Mommy I would take care of her." Rosalind's legs collapsed, and she sank to the grass, sobbing. Jeanne clumsily patted her, but this only seemed to make her cry harder. "We've got to find Batty," said Skye to Geoffrey and Jeanne. "What about Hound?" said Geoffrey. "What about him? Can he track people?" The 3 Penderwicks stared at Geoffrey. Why hadn't they thought of that? A little color came back into Rosalind's face, and she leapt to her feet. "Come on," she cried, and took off for the cottage with the others tearing after her. Hound was in the cottage barking like an insane creature. As soon as Rosalind opened the front door, he made a determined dash for freedom, almost knocking down Jeanne, but Geoffrey tackled him and held on until they could explain to him what had to be done. "Jeanne, go get something of Batty's," said Rosalind. It took only a minute for Jeanne to fetch Funty from Batty's bedroom. Rosalind stuck the blue elephant under Hound's nose. "Find Batty," she said. Hound gave her a look of great disdain. He knew his job better than they did. "I think he understands," said Geoffrey. "Hope so," said Rosalind. "Let him go. We'll follow him." In a flash, Hound was out the door and speeding toward the hedge tunnel. Batty had been walking in the hot sun for over 2 hours, though she herself didn't know how long it had been. She had no watch and couldn't tell time, anyway. She only knew that she was hungry and thirsty and tired. and now she had come to a road. As roads go, it wasn't a busy one. She had been standing there for a few minutes already, and not one car had gone by. But a road was a road, and her father had forbidden her to ever cross one by herself. Her spirits were flagging. Cameron now seemed too far away to reach before night came, and she wished all of a sudden that she could turn around and go back to the cottage. But she couldn't go back. She had to go forward, which meant that she had to cross this road. Batty looked left, then right, then left again. There were still no cars. She closed her eyes for courage, put one hesitant foot onto the asphalt, then paused. She had heard something. Could it be? Yes, there it was again, a bark. Batty whirled around and saw the most wonderful dog in the world, flying straight to her. "Hound!" she cried, and threw her arms open. He leapt right into them, and the two tumbled to the ground and rolled over and over in a frenzy of joyful reunion. But the happiness didn't last, for within seconds, Batty heard shouting. She raised her head and saw Geoffrey racing toward her, and behind Geoffrey, her 3 sisters, all of them frantically yelling. And although Batty couldn't understand a word, for they were still too far away, she knew it had to be about poor Yaz and what a terrible child she was. She jumped up, took hold of Hound's collar, and tried to haul him toward the road. "Come on, we have to get away." Hound dug his 4 feet into the ground and resisted. There was no way he was letting Batty cross that road. She tugged, and he tugged back until, in despair, she let go of his collar. If he wouldn't go with her, she'd just have to keep going alone. Batty closed her eyes again and ran out into the road, just as a car came into view. "It was amazing, Daddy. Geoffrey snatched her right out of the jaws of death," said Jeanne. "You're scaring him," said Skye. "The car wasn't even close." "I was scared," he said. "I was terrified." She reached over and took hold of Batty's little arm. She never wanted to let go of it again. "And Geoffrey gave me a piggyback all the way to the cottage," said Batty, snuggling cozily with Funty in Mr. Penderwick's lap. "Now, Rosalind, tell again how Hound rescued Yaz." "We've already heard that one 4 times. We need to put you to bed," said Mr. Penderwick. The family was still gathered around the kitchen table after dinner. "No, Daddy, not yet," said Batty comfortably. "A little while longer, then." Mr. Penderwick would have denied his youngest nothing that night. "But I need to talk to your sister seriously, so no more Yaz stories for a few minutes, okay?" "Okay," Batty said, and fell instantly asleep with her head on his shoulder. "Mrs. Tifton called me this afternoon," said Mr. Penderwick. "Uh-oh," said Skye. "She was rightly upset about Hound racing around her gardens, and I apologized and assured her that it would never happen again." "As it will not," he said, looking under the table at Hound, who was finishing off a steak veal just for him. But that wasn't the difficult part of the conversation. Mrs. Tifton also let me know in strong language that I don't exercise enough control over you girls. "Oh," said Rosalind, offended. "What did you say?" asked Skye. "Satis eloquentiae sapientiae param." His daughters looked at him with blank faces. "Yes, well, Mrs. Tifton doesn't know Latin any more than you girls do, thank heavens." It wasn't a particularly polite thing to say, especially as she may be right. "Of course she's not right," said Rosalind. "Look at what happened today," he said. "Could I ever have forgiven myself if we'd lost Batty for good?" "But we didn't," said Skye. "Mrs. Tifton doesn't know what she's talking about, Daddy," said Jane. "You're a perfect father." "Not perfect, Jane-o." Mr. Penderwick shook his head. "There's more. Mrs. Tifton seems to believe that the Penderwicks are a bad influence over Geoffrey. According to her, when she told him to go back to Arundel Hall after the Hound incident, not only did he refuse, but he didn't come home for another hour." "He was busy finding Batty," said Skye. "I know that, and you all know that, but Mrs. Tifton's idea is that Geoffrey is suddenly rebellious, and it's because of you girls." "If Geoffrey is rebelling, which I don't admit for an instant, it's because of awful Dexter, not us," said Skye. "And Dexter is Mrs. Tifton's boyfriend," said Rosalind. "He is not nice." "Though not as unnice as Mrs. Tifton," said Jane. "Almost," said Skye darkly. "It's a wonder even she can put up with him." "People sometimes make unexpected choices when they're lonely," said Mr. Penderwick. "Mrs. Tifton lonely?" Rosalind hadn't thought of that. Good grief, don't start getting all sympathetic, said Skye. You can't feel sorry for someone who thinks that we, the Penderwicks, are a bad influence on Geoffrey. We're not, are we, Daddy? Said Jeanne. I see nothing in Geoffrey to make me think he's under any bad influence whatsoever, let alone yours. He's a great boy, and now that he saved Batty's life twice, said Jeanne. Skye frowned horribly at her to shut up, but luckily Hound chose that moment to toss his steak bone into his water bowl, and the resulting flood distracted Rosalind and Mr. Penderwick. When the mess was cleaned up, Mr. Penderwick started again. As I was saying, in some cultures it's believed that when a person saves someone from death, he or she forever owns a part of that someone's soul. So Geoffrey is now linked to our family, whether he likes it or not. That's kind of romantic, said Jeanne. Romantic? Schmomantic. What the heck would Geoffrey do with Batty's soul? Said Skye. Batty opened her eyes sleepily. He could marry me, she said. Marry you? Jeanne and Rosalind laughed while Skye fell off her chair and rolled around the floor like Hound when his back itched. Nevertheless, said Mr. Penderwick seriously. His daughters knew that tone. Everyone quieted down, and Skye got back into her chair. We must remember that we're guests here at Arundel. I know that Mrs. Tifton is not the warmest of women, and the one time I met her with Cadme, she tried to impress me with her knowledge of Campanula persifolia. She pronounced it Campanula perspicolia. Well, that's beside the point. What I'm trying to say is that whatever you think of Mrs. Tifton, you must still be on your best behavior in her home. You're right, Daddy, said Rosalind. We'll be perfect ladies. I won't, said Skye. I will, however, be gentlemanly. It's the same thing in the end, said Jeanne. It's not the same thing at all. Is it? Enough. Touch-a-tay. Mr. Penderwick stood up, Batty still in his arms. Let's all put ourselves to bed. It's been a long day.